5 Network. This is Open Line.
Hello everyone, welcome to Open Line. I'm Ben Hall. Good show tonight. We are talking about history, Nashville history. And there can be a tendency to sanitize or clean up or even erase painful parts of our history. But we're gonna take some of that head on tonight. And I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Lee Williams Jr., TSU professor, to talk about a project that you have been doing. You've started the North Nashville Heritage Project. You're a professor of African American and public history at TSU. I follow you on Twitter.
I appreciate that.
I'm blown away by some of the stuff you put out there. You put out some of these newspaper clippings, and we'll get to some of those in a moment, that really shed light on the slave trade that happened right here in Nashville, and a part of our history that we either forget or want to forget. And I want to get to that in a moment, but let's start with what is the North Nashville Heritage Project? What is that?
It was a project that was started in 2009, my first year at TSU. It's an interesting story. I was in a grocery store and my department head called me and asked me if I would get involved in this project they were working on, and it's the Gateway to Heritage Project. And I didn't know anybody, and I saw it as an opportunity to get involved in the community, so of course I said yes. And it ended up being one of the most rewarding projects that I had gotten involved in, because it was a bit more involved than just what they constructed underneath the underpass. We took a tour of Jefferson Street. It was me and a public history class that I was teaching. And we walked from about 12th Avenue North all the way back to TSU. And I was aware of the history of Jefferson Street a little bit because I studied civil rights as a graduate student. But the tour guide told me a lot of things that I did not know. I was aware of Fisk because my dissertation advisor actually came to Nashville in 1966 to learn how to teach African American history. And he actually wrote the book, The History of Fisk University. So I was aware of Fisk. I knew about Meharry because my doctor was a Meharry graduate. And I knew about TSU because TSU was, and is an HBCU. And I'm from Tallahassee, and I attended a school that is a rival of TSU. So I was aware of all of that. I knew about Dan Nash, and I knew about John Lewis and all these famous people. But when we returned to class and we began to talk about what we had seen, my students asked me questions that I really could not answer.
Questions about the history
about
there of Jefferson Street?
History beyond the civil rights movement, beyond the businesses that were there. In my classes, I emphasize studying history on the margins. That is, the people that we don't really pay attention to, the people that oftentimes whose voices get muted, when we talk about spaces. So they asked me questions I didn't know, and being nimble on my feet, I said, okay, we'll figure this out together. So that's how the project started. Initially, it was just oral histories, because many of my students were from Nashville, and they knew even less about this area than I did.
But you weren't from Nashville.
Oh, I'm from Tallahassee.
And so I think that's interesting. So you come to this historic area, maybe with a fresh set of eyes. Maybe there are people that think all of this history is written down and known somewhere, but it's really not. It's being passed down from generation to generation and being slowly forgotten.
And I think the really important question is why? Why don't we talk about these events and talk about these people. And then another important question, I think, is who determines what we talk about, who determines what we discuss. And if we're going to elevate them, if we're going to celebrate them, who makes that decision? So there's some of the things we probe with the project, but in a nutshell, the class decided that we were going to tell the stories. We were going to speak to these people and allow them to reveal their own truths. And that's it in a nutshell. And to be honest, I'm a professor of African American history, and one of my major fields is Reconstruction. So I was always interested in the transition of African Americans from slavery to freedom. And within that, I looked oftentimes at how communities made the transitions from enslaved to free people.
How much history is there in Nashville about that time period? I guess, how much is hidden and how much is right out in the open? Take us back to that period.
First, let me say this. Most of the stuff that I talk about is not new. We have historians that have been out there and have been doing tremendous work. But oftentimes I don't know if we as academics are skilled at speaking to other audiences. Like I was formerly trained to write papers and present them to conferences and so forth. So maybe if I'm lucky, 20 people will hear this research. If I write an article, maybe a few of my friends, and then if somebody that's doing work in that area, maybe they'll read it. But said all that to say there's none of the stuff is really new. But having said that, we don't know a lot about it. In speaking about public knowledge of what occurred here in Nashville, it's not really taught in schools. So if you don't know someone like me or somebody that studied history, if you don't visit those spaces, it may be new to you. I think what I've did, and this is kind of new for me because I had to train myself to speak to broader audiences, to different audiences. I had to learn to move beyond my office on TSU's campus or my classrooms and to speak to people in other spaces. So hence, I have a very strong Twitter presence, and forgive me sometimes for because I know the late night tweets can get pretty rough.
Well, they've gotten me, and we have an example, and I think it'll help get us into things. Let's put up one of your tweets. This is the tweet that I believe appears at the top of your page, and what you're talking about here are missing person ads from post-Civil War newspapers, and it reveals the desperation that black families felt after the war as they were trying to find their loved ones. And so this says, information wanted of my daughter, Martha Janice, when last heard from was in Montgomery, Alabama, but is supposed to have gone to Mobile. She formerly belonged to Dr. Barrett, Princeton, Kentucky, and was sold to Mr. John James, Nashville, Tennessee, about 9 years ago, since which time she has not been seen by me. Information of her will be thankfully received by her mother, addressing Colored Tennessean Box, and there's the address. Mm-hmm. That, you see that, and it's astounding to me. What year are we talking about? This would, I guess, right after the Civil War.
How did you? 1866.
1866.
It for me, it reveals just how negatively the enslavement of blacks affected the black family, because as you read that ad, you see that this person's family was everywhere. So here he is, he's putting out a newspaper ad here in Nashville, pleading for help. And I think that's one of the most powerful stories of Reconstruction. That is the effort of African Americans to reconnect with their loved ones. Some of these stories are pretty uplifting, but some are examples of some of the worst tragedies that I can imagine. If you can imagine being torn away from your family and thinking that you'll never see them again, and then once the war ends, you realize that there's a possibility that you can find them, but you're not really sure where your parents are at. I think my mom might be in Mobile, where Mobile is a long way from here. So how do you, I mean, it's like a hope against hope. So these ads, and I pinned them because they represent, at least to me, a very stark example of the hope and the desperation of black families at that time.
And are there a lot of ads like that? Did you find a lot of that?
And there's the ones that I posted are from the Colored Tennessean, and that's just one newspaper in Nashville that existed for a short period of time. But they are everywhere. If you were to look in places like Louisville or Lexington, Huntsville or Birmingham, and those newspapers, you see the same sort of things. When the war ended, there were about 4 million African Americans, formerly enslaved African Americans, that are living in the South. The vast majority of them, and I could probably make a pretty good argument to say all of them, had either directly experienced a family member being sold or had witnessed one being sold. And I don't think that we as human beings can see that sort of thing and not be affected by it in really profound ways.
And I feel like that is a story that isn't talked about very much. The effort, the frantic, desperate effort, as that ad reveals, to just find family members that were scattered, not even scattered to the wind, that were sold to different places in the country. And historically speaking, how successful were ads like that? How many families found success and found each other again, and how many didn't?
I can't say for certain, but at my first job, my grad students actually went to work on a project like this. It involved a guy living out of Rome, Georgia, who was appealing to the Army to help him find his family. So they successfully found his children, and they were reunited at least in the 1880 census. But I really can't say. The Freedmen's Bureau oftentimes helped. They served as a missing persons bureau oftentimes. So if you have a bureau agent here in Nashville, he could get word to a bureau agent maybe in Memphis or someplace like that, and put in a call for somebody.
All right, we're gonna have to take a break. I encourage you to call in if you want to call in, be part of the conversation. If you're on the line, hold on. There's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We're also going to talk about the public square. Here in Nashville, you have some newspaper clippings that indicate what was happening there. It's fascinating. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.